So, to kick things off, I am delighted to welcome you to the GoodCourse EDI Leaders Roundtable. Binna, Alex, great to have you back again, and Al, lovely to have you on the call today. And so, of course, today we're focusing in on how universities can promote inclusion and support the LGBTQ plus staff and students on campus. And I'm excited that we're going to be exploring this through two specific lenses. So, how EDI teams can leverage data to ensure they're providing sort of tailored support, and also what practical initiatives that there are that that you're working on that are working well on campuses, and where there's still work to do. But at this point, I'd love to hand over to Alex and Allan to introduce yourselves. I would say let's go in alphabetical order, but that's going to be confusing. Alex, as you've done this before, do you want to show us how it's done?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kitty. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name's Alex Prestage. I'm Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion here at Queen Mary University, London. My role is all about supporting the university to deliver our people, culture and inclusion enabling plan, and ultimately to realise our vision to be the most inclusive university of our kind by 2030.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. And Allan?
Brilliant. Hi everyone. So I'm All Leville and I work at the University of Reading, and I've a split role actually. So I'm the Dean for Diversity and Inclusion for most of the week, but my background's in clinical psychology. So I hold a post as an Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology, and that's where a lot of my research interests have come from, particularly LGBT plus mental health. And my remit as Dean is overseeing the university strategy, and similar to Alex, we have a set of ambitions, but ours are by 2026, which is our centenary year as a university.
Fantastic. And then, of course, my wonderful co-host, Binna. Binna, do you want to have a quick intro? I know it's not on the agenda, we're straying there, but would you like to have a quick intro?
That's an easy one. I don't think I can handle that one, Kitty. So I'm Binna Candola. I'm a psychologist as well, a business psychologist, and the senior partner and chair of Perm Candola, a practice of business psychologists, and have worked the whole of my career actually with diversity, inclusion, equality at the core of everything that we do and I do.
Fantastic. So clearly quite the lineup. So to dive into the meat of the conversation, Allan, it would be wonderful if you could kick us off talking about your work as a clinician. I know you talk about sort of the importance of collecting data on sexual orientation and how that's key to identifying and signposting to the correct support. Are you able to talk into for us how your department sort of approaches the challenge of data collection and analysis, and sort of how that informs the support it provides?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's something I've been writing about for almost 10 years now, looking at data collection in clinical settings. But I think the principles are very similar, if not the same. So essentially, why are we collecting this data? To understand more about the diversity of our workforce or the people that we're working with or working for. But then the other part of the story is not just stopping there, but it really is the inclusion part, isn't it? Where how are we using that data? How is it informing what we're doing, and how are we going to take that forward? And I always find that initial conversation with around data, be it with colleagues or trainee clinicians, it can be a bit of, okay, so that's what we need to do, but what's the so what? And what are we saying to people about why we're collecting that data? And I like to flip it on its head, really, saying, well, if we didn't have any of that data, how do we know the diversity or the people that we're working with or for? And then also, how can we make sure that our strategy is appropriately aligning with the people that are within our community? And that's often the take home point. But also bearing in mind the potential sensitivities in data collection. Now, I came out years ago, I identify as bi, and for me, I don't really mind answering that question at all. However, that's not to assume that everyone will be the same. And I think that's true across protected characteristics. So we're engaging in a comms campaign shortly, just looking at staff data. Some of our declaration rates for some protected characteristics are much higher than others. Sexual orientation and gender reassignment are two which we're looking at improving. The other side of that, so it's not just not a numbers game. A lot of my research, my background is qualitative investigation. So we did a piece of work, or two pieces of work actually, a few years ago, that were a survey with over 200 students nationally to look at student experience, broadly, but also specifically within the LGBT plus community, and a piece of work at Reading where we interviewed a number of students about their student experience and what the university can do more of. And I think that's just, if not more, interesting to have that qualitative data, which has lent itself to analysis and then recommendations.
It brings the sort of colour to those numbers. Alex, it would be great for you to please share your experiences here, and also how you set quantitative targets to sort of measure your progress against.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got many of the same common issues as Al's just described, and I recognise each and every one of them. And particularly in my work as an EDI practitioner around LGBTQA plus inclusion and setting those targets, in the ways that we might approach, say, gender or ethnicity, it can be quite easy to set targets based on a benchmark that we will hit gender balance by 2030, or will be more reflective of our local community by 2030. With LGBT people, given the low levels of disclosure, both by LGBT people, but also by cisgender heterosexual people, it's really difficult to set those benchmarks and those targets. With our data often isn't as strong as we need it to be to have such robust quantifiable targets. So I tend to focus on experience and attempting at least to quantify experience through data, looking at disparities between cohorts. Are LGB and T people as likely to respond in staff surveys that they feel confident being their full and proper selves at work? Do they feel that they can bring their whole self to work when we compare that to straight colleagues or to cisgender colleagues, people who aren't trans? So there's the experience gaps there that we can quantify, increasingly so, and there's a lot of evidence out there. Advocacy organisations, charities have some great evidence bases that universities and other sectors can draw on, particularly in the workplace. And Al's sort of brought to life some of the stats there around disclosure, but it's still a shocking. Well, it shocked me the number of people who still don't feel comfortable coming out at work. As well, in 2018, Stonewall and YouGov did some research that suggests almost 1 in 5 LGB people don't disclose their identity and aren't out at work. And we're actually seeing over the past 5 years an increase in trans people hiding or mitigating, sort of censoring themselves in the workplace, and we're actually going backwards. So I think it's it's a source of concern for me as an EDI practitioner that we aren't actually necessarily making as much progress as we might like to see. That more trans people in the world of work are hiding their trans identity or who they are than they were 5 years ago, and that's a marked increase. Previously, it was still a very high number. 50% of trans people had hidden a part of their identity, and we're now up to 2/3. So we're not getting any better, and there's a lot to unpack there.
Can you point to sort of particular reasons why it's gone from 50% to 2/3 there?
I think the social, political, cultural landscape that we exist in, the UK and universities in particular, have become a real hotbed for a culture war that has been imposed on trans people. That trans inclusion has become a real hot topic and a polarizing issue that maybe disingenuously people can stoke and know can get a rise and a response out of. It's political football to me, and I don't try not to buy into the culture wars, but it's a reality of universities' contexts, and pushing the push and the pull of academic freedom, the right to psychological safety at work when you're studying, and what it means to be inclusive.
Mm. Binna, did you have anything you wanted to come in there with?
The point about collecting data, actually, Al's point, and it was kind of supported by Alex, the lack of the response that you get in surveys to collect the data. And I was with a client recently. I mean, this is like towards the end of last year, and we were looking at the monitoring data they collected, and they were particularly interested in the lack of response on ethnicity, and the response was low. The response was low, or lower than you would like. And we were having a conversation about that, and they sent the data across to me, the results. I said, but your response rate on LGBTQ plus it's like significantly lower than that. And it was I'd be interested to hear from the two of you actually, because I asked the question, why aren't we talking about that? Because actually, if you took it by the lack of response, you take the worst with the area where you get the least response, and we talk about that at the most. In fact, we weren't talking about that at all. And I'd be interested to hear your views actually about why you think that is.
Oh, it's a big question. It's a good question. I think traditionally our systems and the way that we collect data have been imperfect, and that's being generous. They haven't necessarily represented the breadth of identities that exist under the LGBTQA plus umbrella. It is an umbrella. It's a diversity of experiences, identities, ways in which people interact with the world around them and with themselves and others. And that's very personal. It's hyper diverse. Universities in particular, and our data regulators and agencies are now starting to get in line and understand the ways in which we can craft questions and give people the options that truly reflect their experiences and their identities. Higher Education Statistics Authority, HESA for short, has made some really positive changes in terms of encouraging more and more people to disclose their gender identity and gender reassignment, and where they might be in that process. Whereas 5 years ago we didn't have that, and data streams take a while to run clear, if you get me. I could start collecting data tomorrow. I won't have anything that I can actually draw conclusions from for a good 3 years or so. So it's a process. We're getting better. Absolutely, there's the reflecting the reality of LGBTQIA plus people's everyday experiences. We're getting there. We're not there yet.
Yeah, but you need to be persistent. I mean, is that
Absolutely?
So we carry on year after year. We carry on doing these surveys, hopefully getting a higher response each time.
You'd hope so.
Yeah.
Al, do you have anything to add on the idea of these sort of low response rate?
It's something that we discussed an awful lot in autumn term because we're setting our ambitions for 2026, and we looked at all of our protected characteristics and declaration rate, and our difference was quite stark. Between ethnicity was 89%, it's burnt into my mind, sorry, and sexual orientation was 46%. We are having a conversation about declaration rates for ethnicity need to be better, and that's part of our race equality review that's published last May. But when we look at why, I always think and discuss with people about how offensive I personally find the other box, that there's no preferred self-describe and you're put into an other box, and I discuss with students and colleagues about what message does that send? How would people feel? And people are very honest and say, well, actually, it's just saying you're different. You can go in this other box that we don't really understand you. And pushing that to think actually in the mechanisms and how we're collecting this data in these categories, if we've got lesbian, gay, bi, other, and then we stop, we're missing a huge amount of the community. And as Alex rightly said, the umbrella. And thinking about, is it good enough? Is our mechanism good enough? Do we need to expand this? And sometimes a counter argument is, oh, well, we can't include it till the end of time. Well, actually, look at other protected characteristics where we do have many categories. And why don't we have a similar number of categories for LGBTQ+?
Just to follow up on that, I think we've come an enormously long way in the UK in a short space of time in terms of LGBT inclusion and rights. It's in living memory that homosexuality was decriminalised, and universities in particular, academics, they have long careers. Once you're an academic, you're likely to remain an academic for a very long time. I remember when I was studying, I was a young student back then, but I had LGBT mentors and academics who had different experiences. We had an academic who was very sort of the David Hockney, like, pre-decriminalization era of gay men, who could never really conceptualize that he could come out at work and be openly gay with his colleagues, and how he interacted with colleagues was very different to how the next generation, that are the generation of equal marriage, of civil partnerships, being able to maintain an open relationship with your partner, and have that recognized by the state. And then they said to me, sort of, you're the next generation that is really driving change, that is questioning, do we want these? What is LGB big enough? Is it broad enough? Does it describe our identities? And are we going far enough? So there's been a lot of movement very quickly. Many of our colleagues, especially long-standing colleagues, will have experiences where they, especially early in their career, were told actively to keep their sexuality a secret, to hide that. And during your formative years, that's going to have an impact on you as to how willing you are to trust institutions, like universities, like employers, with that kind of data that perhaps is still seen as very sensitive, personal, and something that doesn't belong in the workplace.
And it is sensitive and personal, isn't it? I
Mm,
mean, and I take the point actually about the categories don't describe people's identities fully enough, so they can't see themselves in the list
mm.
of categories. But are you suggesting though that if we got the categories right, that actually the response rates would increase significantly?
I think it's a step. It's not a silver bullet, and I don't think that changing those classifications would go all the way. I think we have to remember that approximately between 6 and 8 of the population in the UK identify as LGBT. That is a pretty small, often invisible minority.
Hmm.
It's not a characteristic that you can spot, despite what some people think. You can't see LGBT people walking down the street and be like, oh, okay. It doesn't work like that. It's often an invisible community within your workforce, and that the much of the non-disclosure often comes from people that don't identify into the LGBT umbrella. That actually we need cisgender heterosexual colleagues to tell us that their identity as well, to disclose. That is as important to us in terms of knowing our workforce and our student body, as it is being able to identify a proportion of our workforce that identifies under the LGBT umbrella. So yeah, I would encourage everyone, if there's one thing that people on the line are thinking, what can I do to help? Go into your HR system and update your personal details now. Disclose if you feel comfortable, even if you just say prefer not to say. You are giving your employer a little more information, and they can explore that. Yeah, it's a really easy 5-minute job.
It's really interesting what you were saying about it being in living memory as well. Not that the staff were actively encouraged not to identify, and I have perhaps little doubt that there might be some fear around the idea of self-identifying could at a later date perhaps be used in the wrong way against you. So there
Mm.
must be some fear with that living memory, sort of that shadow hanging over us today. Unless anyone wants to add anything else in particular to this element of the conversation, I was going to move on to the 6th point on our agenda. Al, one of Reading's goals in your annual D&I report is to increase participation of Reading's LGBT plus and ally staff by 100% by 2026. Are you able, please, to talk into why this was such an important goal to measure yourselves against, and also how this practically manifests itself in an enhanced student and staff experience?
Absolutely, thank you. And part of this, I think, relates back to the previous question as well. So my response to that would have been a sense of belonging. And I think you can never underestimate the importance of sense of belonging. And through my journey, and then I'll go directly to the question. When I was at Reading, I was a student at Reading, a master's student and a doctoral student, and then became a member of staff. And when I was a student, I never saw any LGBT plus ally material. I didn't really see any events. And one of the big key considerations in related back to data is where we set ambitions for ethnicity and gender, our data is far, far better. We know the representations on our key committees. We know the representation in terms of associate professor and professor and the high grade professional services staff. We don't have complete enough data for LGBT plus at the moment. And this ambition is different though, because what we wanted to do, and we spoke to our student and staff community to see what's really important to them. And I absolutely despise assumption-based driven models. So for me, it was very much talking to our staff network, talking to our student society, and people were saying, I want to see more people like me, or someone like me. I want to feel that I belong here. I want to see role models. I want to see more allies. And we're thinking about the role of our staff network. And whilst so I was one of the co-chairs of our LGBT plus staff network before I got my dean tenure. And as part of the co-chair, you are out, you are representing the network and thinking about the importance of that for the community, that people see you as someone that you can talk to, you can go to for confidential advice, and developing that within the membership of the network. But also thinking of our students. So some of the work I alluded to before, I felt that this would come up in the research, but it surprised me how strongly about the importance of seeing lanyards, LGBT plus lanyards, the importance of the university attending local pride, for example, having conversations in the classroom, and also some conversations that I've had that I was privileged enough to work with a number of students who wanted to do a project in LGBT plus mental health, most of which happened to identify as bi. There was no criteria, of course, but most of my students did identify as bi, and some identified in terms of allies to the community. And I had one student that spoke to me towards the end of last year, I believe it was, right towards the end of their 3-year degree. And they spoke to me about being bi and also being disabled, and I identify as being disabled as well, and how different parts of your identity intersect. And they were saying that I was the first member of staff that they've ever told, and they've been at that university for 3 years, and that gave them the confidence to come out, and they're quite public on Twitter, and they came out on Twitter, and we were talking about the importance of looking at someone in an intersectional way, and that's longer term ambition as well. So when we're talking about role models and allies, we're also talking about BAME, LGBT plus role models and allies, and we're also talking about disability and neurodiversity. So in terms of how we measure that and consider that, again, there's, as part of organisations that take part in the Stonewall Workplace Quality Index, they'll know there's a survey for staff experience already, but looking at a mechanism to capture a student experience. And I am a fan of, surveys have their purpose, but I think having conversations with the student society, the staff network, and getting that qualitative data is just, if not more important. So that's how we got to that goal.
Alex, when it comes to the work where you've been focusing some of your work, delivering and engaging staff in trans inclusion training is something you've been working hard on at QMUL. Can you please talk into some of the key outcomes you were solving here and how you were measuring these?
Absolutely. Yeah. Trans inclusion training in one guise or another has been a kind of a constant throughout my career. I've worked in several different organizations. I started off in students' unions, providing services for diverse students and helping students to engage with issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion, then moved into universities and to help service leaders to develop essentially inclusive services that include trans people, and there's a real pressing need for that. I think often the layperson, the uninducted, is terrified, underconfident that they're going to get it wrong, that they're going to offend, and that they are going to give this person, this trans person, student, member of staff, a suboptimal, a bad experience because they aren't equipped with the skills, the knowledge, or the ability to navigate all of these questions that they have, and the uncertainty there. So the trans inclusion training that I developed over my career and have delivered to over 500 people in a few years, fundamentally seeks to build up that confidence, to provide what I would call a brave space for the uninducted to come and to ask those questions, to sometimes get it wrong, but to feel supported, that I'm meeting them where they're at, and that even if they're like, oh, I don't know how to say this properly, I'm like, go and give it a go, and we can learn from that. So even if people fumble it, even if people get it wrong, it's about meeting them wherever in the journey they are with all the goodwill and saying, actually, we can take you a little bit further, because most people want to learn, they want to be confident, they want to do better, they want to provide a world-class student experience, and they want to help staff feel included and, as we've said, sort of feel that sense of belonging. They want to have those conversations, they don't want to tiptoe around it. So that's what I've been trying to do, and to bring trans voices, trans experiences to the front and center of that. I don't identify as trans myself, but I make sure that in my training, I've sense checked it, and I've given trans students, trans staff the opportunity to have a look through it, to experience that training firsthand, and to say, yes, this is what we think the university needs, or tweak this, and here's some feedback, which is really compelling. It helps establish not only trans inclusion as a priority, but trans students are often left feeling that they don't belong. They're disproportionately more likely to consider discontinuing or dropping out of their studies. These are ways that we can build a relationship that says your transness matters to us and is helping the university be a better educator. So it really helps to centre there. The previous podcast we had Stefan, who was part of Trans EDU, has created some brilliant resources and videos that I've often used in the training to centre those voices of trans students in higher and further education, to help bring to life, if you've been a victim of harassment, street harassment, on the way into your lecture, your mind's going to be all over the place. Are you going to be in the place that mentally to study, to attain good degree outcomes? What does that mean for you? And so the extra layers of support that we can offer as a university, as educators, is different for trans people. So some of it was unpacking that, centering those voices, helping people feel confident, and overwhelmingly the impact, not only as have people fed back to me, and we've done the usual evaluation around providing good quality facilitation and training, the content over the years, which overwhelmingly people are like, yeah, this is really great, and I'd recommend it to a friend. But people have gone above and beyond and said, actually, this doesn't just make me better at my job. I feel like I'm a better parent now. I can identify more strongly with my children and their generation often more mature or older people, different generations, feel that young people get this and are speaking a completely different language to one that they understand. So giving people the opportunity to come together, discuss that, and find mutual ground has been really important, and it can be deployed in a variety of ways. It's something I really love doing. When I was working at King's College London, King's has the Science Gallery London, which is all about bringing art and science, cutting edge research together to engage young people. They did a season on gender and wanted it to be trans inclusive. We gave all Science Gallery London staff trans inclusion training. It's that simple.
Yeah. It's so important to have that sort of inclusive development as part of the process of creating that training. And I love the idea of brave spaces. I think some of our politicians could do with a brave space. Given the intensity of the political conversation around this topic, have you seen that sort of uptake of the training that you offer positively, negatively? Has that changed the conversation that's happening within your training sessions?
I wouldn't say in training sessions specifically. I think it's definitely intensified the perception of this is risky, this is difficult, and it's scary. And I think particularly how the ongoing discourse is represented in mainstream media adds to that toxicity, that many leaders feel that they will be personally vilified or attacked, and that it will harm their reputation, the institution as well. So it's definitely seen as a riskier space to be in. And I've got a good network of EDI practitioners across higher education and beyond, but particularly across higher education recently, a lot of us have noticed there's more scrutiny. Leaders want more assurance, both from a legal perspective and from a reputation base, that this is becoming something that we need to really do a bit more work on and demonstrate. Queen Mary, I'm very proud to say, has just renewed and reviewed our trans inclusion statement of commitment, in light of all the ongoing new legal context, case law, etc. And it reaffirms our commitment to trans inclusion, to clarify for trans students and our whole community a really balanced approach to setting those expectations behaviourally and culturally. And that definitely was really important to engage our leaders with, and to help them feel supported and confident in making the right decision, which I think we have.
And of course, in that, on that piece around more work, there is so clearly more work to be done on trans inclusion. Allyship becomes pretty sort of essential to the conversation, to creating lasting change. Binna, I know you'll have a lot to say on that.
Yeah, I was just interested in to hear what Al and Alex got to say. When Al was talking about listening to the groups, you went to the groups and they said, actually, this is what we want, and building the kind of strategies out of that. And one of the things was, actually, we want to see more people. I want to see more people like me around here. So there's this notion of being represented. And what's the distinction you draw between being represented and being an ally?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to take that one. I think also, well, I think there's a few different bits that are going through my mind. There's the representation in terms of unpicking and unpacking that acronym. So people I feel very passionate about identify as bi, I don't identify as gay, and I know other people identify in different ways, and respecting how individuals identify themselves. So I think there's that representation of a particular identity. But then also thinking about allyship, and often I think people can think about allyship just from the perspective of being heterosexual. But as Alex has commented on a few times, thinking about what it means to be a trans ally when you identify as cisgender. And also, I would say, unpacking that further around your understanding for sexual identities and also gender identities, and what it means to be an ally in those areas. So, although I'd say that I don't represent everyone who's bi, but I'm engaged in some training with Stonewall to be a bi role model. And I represent bi individuals in that sense, but I'm very much an ally across other identities under that umbrella. So I think that's how I'd distinguish the two. Brilliant. Yeah, we've quite a lot recently. We've been thinking about it, particularly in the context of race, actually, but also more broadly, and looking at that active allyship. And we're very much about, I know often people say calling out, but also calling in and educating. And I know Stonewall really advocate for that approach. And that's what I'd see an ally doing, is calling out or calling in inappropriate behaviour, maybe through the understand, however, therefore the UHT method or equivalent. But before you get to that point, you need to know what isn't okay. And I don't mean that in a patronising way, but I know the Active Bystander company that do a lot of the active bystander training have their focus very much is on that in terms of the education of sexism, misogyny, ableism, etc. Because when I've had conversations with people, so for example in biphobia, which is different to homophobia, and has unique characteristics to it, it's quite interesting when people say, oh, you're just greedy because you're bi, or does that mean you're more likely to cheat because you're bi? And these things that people think are acceptable to say, but simply aren't. And I think that goes back to the importance of like the trans inclusion training or bi inclusion training, that education part first. And you can't be an ally unless you're well informed, I would say.
Yeah, and going back to the point you making about trans, when you look at social media, which I don't do that often, to be honest, Alex, and you kind of hear that some of the if a journalist wants to get attention or a politician wants to get attention, they will kind of talk about wokeness, won't they? And trans seem to be one of those ones where you mentioned it already. Actually, you will get a response. So if you want to draw attention to yourself as somebody who's standing out and speaking out about things that other people are afraid to, you speak about trans, don't you? And what impact does that have on people in terms of being prepared to kind of discuss it? I mean, how does it impact your work rather in terms of getting people to engage with it?
Fundamentally, I'd say I'd bounce the question back and say, how does it impact trans people? A lot of my trans friends, trans people I know, have almost entirely withdrawn from social media because it is such a toxic environment to constantly be subjected to your existence, or the fact whether you're a safeguarding risk or whether you can use X or Y toilet, your rights that have been enshrined in the Equality Act since 2010, being questioned actively, and that being painted as normal and a completely reasonable thing to ask. Many of my trans colleagues, my trans friends, just the toll that it takes on their mental health is so utterly disproportionate that they've withdrawn from social media, and that they're like, it's not worth it anymore. I don't need that. But it does mean that there is that it's much more reactive. There is definitely a nervousness, well, where's it going to go next? Because it is so volatile, it is unpredictable, and that volatility is being driven, as you say, by a myriad of different actors and agents, and that it's really difficult to get a reasonable and objective, as far as is possible, summary when so much of the UK press adopts a pretty slanted view of trans inclusion, and a pretty regressive view of trans inclusion, if I'm honest. Yeah, it's really difficult to get good quality journalism, information, insight, and expertise, and that really has been a challenge as an EDI practitioner, but has also demonstrated the value of having EDI practitioners. Not only are we at Queen Mary, we say we provide a centre of excellence. We're there to provide that guidance, that advice, and be trusted advisors to our leaders, our strategy, our faculties, our community. So not only do we have that wealth of experience to kind of counter some of the mistruths that are out there, to cut through and say, well, this is the law, this is what it means for university or organization, but it also means that we have connections to our staff, our students, and our community, and that, as Reading and Al seem to be doing really, really well, is to bring it back to them, the people who locally really matter. When you can sit down and say, look, what's our stake in this as a university? Listening to our staff and our students is really important.
But this point about being yourself and being authentic at work. So let's say I was religious, very religious. I follow my faith. My faith says that these groups of people, they're not part of God's plan. And for me to be authentic in the workplace and to be myself in the workplace, I have to be committed and devoted to making this clear to everybody. How does that fit with inclusion?
It's a really good piece of case law.
There's a lot.
Specifically around expressing religious beliefs around same-sex attraction and
Yeah.
marriage, and ultimately it comes down to, can you reconcile under religion and belief as a protected characteristic, that the belief can be reconciled with the values of a democracy, a fair democratic society, i.e. is it lawful? Are you bullying someone? Are you harassing somebody? Are you in some way denigrating their dignity and respect? And that's not exclusive to higher education. Everyone has to conduct themselves within the law, within the workplace. And if you were to go around and to deliberately misgender a trans person and try and say that it was your religion or your belief, you'd probably have a pretty tough time reconciling that with your workplace's dignity and respect and anti-bullying policies and the law more widely. Although there's some current case law and appeals going on. So who knows? But certainly on at least sexual orientation, there's some pretty clear case law there that suggests if you violate people's dignity and respect, your employer has probably been in firm ground to turn around to you and say, look, you can think what you like, how you act and behave when you are working for X organization. You have to do that within our values, within our policies, and you are currently not doing that.
Thank you. So, Kitty, can I ask Allan a very specific question?
Please do. We've got a few minutes.
Because Alan's a psychologist. I just wonder what you think, and I know you teach on this as well. But what do you think the role of psychology and psychiatry has been, and how? Well, what's your over the years? What do you think of the role of psychology and psychiatry has been?
That's a fantastic question, Bill. I think the role of psychology and psychiatry has been very damaging, actually. I think the diagnosis of homosexuality in DSM from 52 to 73, and in some form in the ICD from 92, has been very damaging. I think the unclear, uncertain, potentially misguided disordering of gender identity disorder and now gender dysphoria is often seen by many as a gateway to get appropriate support, but then you're receiving a mental health diagnosis. And I always, going back to my teaching, thinking about the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association, and when the American Psychological Association did the research into is there any empirical data to support this diagnosis, oh, surprise, surprise, there isn't. It's a socially constructed diagnosis by a group of probably white, straight males, going back to the early 50s. It's thinking about how and where did psychology, I would say, potentially go wrong, and pathologizing everyday experiences. And more broadly, and maybe I'm not your typical psychologist in clinical area, but I think that I see similarities there in terms of neurodiversity and over pathologizing everyday experiences. Where I feel psychology is getting a lot better, although it took an awful lot of time to set up the gay and lesbian section, which now, as you know, the Psychology of Sexualities with the British Psychological Society. That is a good and positive step forward, but I feel that what we should still consider is the role of psychology where we know individuals within the LGBT plus community are more likely to have a common or a mental health difficulty and higher risk rates in terms of suicide and self-harm, but not to fall into that old trap of, oh, it's because you're LGBT plus, you're experiencing poor mental health. No, stepping back, and Ida Meyer's model from the mid-90s always sticks in my mind. We're looking at societal and cultural issues and stigma that lend itself to internalized homophobia, etc., that then has a knock-on effect on mental health difficulties. So taking that more holistic step back view is where I feel that psychology should be and could be heading. But originally, I think, and as Alex was saying earlier about legislation, and I focus a lot on my teaching, saying, imagine if you were a gay man in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, and it was legal to have sex with your boyfriend and you had a mental health diagnosis. And I think often people are surprised that both of those components are so recent.
You both mentioned, but you in particular, Alex, about the impact that society's views have on oneself. But this whole notion of self-stigmatization and I mean, how does that play out? Where you kind of start penalizing yourself, don't you?
Oh,
for
absolutely.
being yourself.
Yeah, and then internalized homophobia,
Homophobia, that's what I was looking
biphobia,
for.
transphobia,
Yeah.
etc. It's sort of we live in perhaps a deeply homophobic, biphobic, lesphobic, transphobic society, in the same way that structural racism exists, that misogyny is exists. That is internalized, and anyone who grows up in this society, it would be a miracle for anyone to grow up and not be a little bit homophobic or a little bit transphobic. You
Mm.
have to unlearn that. So you go into a new workplace, and even if you just change job, you may have been out in your previous job, and be very happy to use male pronouns, he pronouns, when referring to your partner, your same-sex partner in your previous workplace. But you come into the next one and you're like, oh, what's it like here? Do I just say, oh yeah, my partner, and kind of hedge your bets? And that's part of the self-censoring, the not bringing your whole self to work, and you check yourself. It's like you're looking over your shoulder when you're talking, sort of who's around, because we've all been trained to check yourself, that you need to keep this a secret, or that part of you is different or to be ashamed of. One of the books that I recommend for understanding myself as a gay man, how to manage me, how to manage other gay men, how to have gay friends, read The Velvet Rage. It's a phenomenal book. It's not perfect, but it comes from a psychiatry perspective, unpicking the damage and the trauma of growing up gay in a straight man's world. And it brings to life some of the impacts that has, and how you self censor and overperform and
Mm.
overachieve, just to be seen as on par with your cisgender straight colleagues.
Mm. Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
How about you,
really.
Al? Sorry, Kitty.
No, no, I'll go for
Before
it.
Sure, I'd say very similar. Um, and thinking about that internalized homophobia, I think the types of classic thoughts that people, and I don't mean classic in a dismissive way, but that people may have is, I'm wrong to feel this way, I shouldn't be feeling this way. My primary caregiver has told me that I'm wrong to feel this way. And I absolutely think that where we look at trauma in some protected characteristics, and rightly so, we really need to explore trauma around
Mm.
denial, suppression, completely ignoring
Mm.
people's own identities and erasing that part of their identity. Um,
Mm.
and I'm very happy to share, in terms of my experience, we grew up in a family where there was almost this perfect, but there was a sort of a perfect ideal. And my brother and I sort of joke, my brother identifies as straight, but we all have our own differences, don't we, in other ways. And we say about the almost Mary Poppins, perfectly perfect. Um, but actually, and for me academically, I've done fairly well. But because of my identity, being attracted to men, it was almost like, oh no, you've gone off slightly wrong there. That's not the road that you should be taking. And trying to be like, oh, you also find women attractive, so that's fully direct you in that area, because otherwise you will be bullied and you'll be a victim of hate crime, and all this scaring fear mongering.
Mm.
And also almost in some ways
Mm.
control. And I think I'll stop there before I say too much.
Mm. Fascinating.
I'm afraid now slightly mindful of time. To round things off, it's been a wonderful conversation, but to round things off, um, Al, could you please share with us something that you've learned over the last year that you wish you'd sort of known at the start of your EDI journey?
I was thinking about this quite a bit, and I've reflected on it a lot myself over the last year or so. And a lot of our discussion today has been about sense of belonging and authentic self at work. And while although that may have some limitations in some regard, I would absolutely say that's the key thing. That when I went into my role and into my EDI, substantive EDI journey, I was very much focused on key parts of my identity. I'd always shared a lot about my bi-identity, not so much about my mental health or being neurodivergent, and trying to mask that neurodivergency for the first year or two within my role until I felt I was well established enough sort of to demask as such, which is exhausting. So I would say, in terms of something wish I knew, be yourself from the beginning and don't use too much resources in trying to hide a particular part of you. And there may be parts of you that you feel more comfortable sharing than others. But in the long run, you're only doing yourself a disservice.
It's really powerful advice, and you're right about different elements being perhaps easier or harder. Alex, the same question to you.
It's a good one. Yeah, from a practitioner lens, many people come to be EDI practitioners for different reasons, but many of us have some lived experience of being the other, and as we've discussed, having sort of maybe experienced trauma, and that can make you angry. You can be quite angry at the world that treats you differently and institutions that have a poor track record. Don't cling on to that. Don't be angry. It's really exhausting. Assume positive intent. Even when people get it wrong, be curious. Have a bit of a laugh if you can, and be like, "Oh, what did you mean by that? Can I play that back to you and maybe help you understand how that could be understood if I took that ungenerously?" And people will come with you. People will appreciate that. People will understand that, and you will be more trusted and more compelling and credible as a result of doing that. Don't let the anger fester. Go for it. Do it with a smile. Bring people with you.
Fantastic advice, and very complimentary to each other's advice, I think, there, which is really nice. Everyone, thank you so much for joining the GoodCourse EDI Roundtable today. It's been really, really fascinating hearing your insight and a pleasure speaking to you. So thank you so much for your time.